December 17, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell thick and silent, muffling the world into a cathedral of white and shadow. 17-year-old Matthias Courier crouched behind a frozen oak, his breath forming ghosts in the air. His father's hunting rifle, a weathered Mauser 98K, pressed against his chest like a relic from another life. He was not a soldier. He wore no uniform, carried no orders, answered to no flag. He was a farm boy from the Walloon Hills, a poacher's son who had spent his childhood stalking wild boar through these same woods, learning to read tracks in mud and snow, to predict movement before it happened, to become invisible in plain sight. The Germans had come 3 days prior, gray columns of Wehrmacht infantry pushing west through the forest, confident, loud, careless. They believed the Ardennes belonged to them. Matthias knew better. This forest had taught him a fundamental truth that no army manual could contain. The hunter does not chase. The hunter waits. The hunter understands terrain not as obstacle, but as ally. And now, as the first Wehrmacht patrol passed within 30 meters of his position, Matthias Courier prepared to translate a lifetime of illegal hunting into something history would struggle to believe. The German offensive through the Ardennes, later called the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's final desperate gamble in the West. Over 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, supported by panzer divisions and artillery, crashed through thinly defended American lines in a massive surprise attack. The forest became a maze of confusion, communication breakdowns, scattered units fighting blind. In this chaos, conventional military doctrine collapsed. Visibility was measured in meters. Radio signals died in the valleys. Supply lines stretched and snapped. The Germans advanced with the confidence of momentum, but momentum in dense winter forest is an illusion. It requires speed, and speed requires knowing where you're going. Matthias Courier had no radio, no command structure, no tactical training. What he possessed was something the Wehrmacht could not replicate: indigenous knowledge. He knew every deer trail, every ridgeline, every place where the forest floor softened into marsh. He knew where sound traveled and where it died. He knew the rhythm of the woods, when birds fell silent, when snow slid from branches, when the air itself changed texture before men approached. His father had been a legendary poacher, hunted by Belgian game wardens for 20 years and never caught once. The old man had taught Matthias a simple principle: a boar has better senses than you, better smell, better hearing, sees movement you think is invisible, so you don't fight his strengths. You use the forest to confuse them. You make the wind your ally. You move when he feeds. You wait where he feels safe, and you never, ever let him know you're hunting him until it's already over. That wisdom, born from necessity and passed through generations of men who survived by outwitting both animals and authorities, was about to be tested against the most formidable military machine in Europe. The Germans moved through the Ardennes as an occupying force. Matthias moved through it as a native predator. They saw obstacles. He saw opportunities. They followed roads and clearings. He owned the spaces between. And on that frozen December morning, as a 10-man Wehrmacht patrol stopped to smoke cigarettes in a clearing Matthias had used for boar ambushes since he was 12 years old, the hunting began. The first shot came at 9:47 a.m., though no German heard it as a shot. The lead soldier, a sergeant with a map case, simply collapsed forward into the snow, and for 3 full seconds his companions stared in confusion, their minds rejecting the possibility of a sniper, because snipers made noise, left muzzle flash, revealed position. Matthias had fired from 180 meters, using a technique his father called the boar's blind spot, positioning himself directly upwind, elevated on a limestone outcrop, with a backdrop of dense pine that swallowed sound and concealed the rifle's report beneath the natural acoustics of wind through branches. Before the patrol could react, he had cycled the bolt and fired again. Another soldier dropped. Now panic replaced confusion. The Germans scattered into the tree line, shouting contradictory orders, firing blindly into the forest. Matthias was already gone, not running, but gliding through a route he'd planned before taking the first shot, moving along a game trail that followed a depression in the terrain, invisible from the clearing. The fundamental mistake the Wehrmacht made was trying to locate him. In boar hunting, the animal's first instinct after a shot is to find the threat. Experienced hunters exploit this. They fire, then immediately relocate to a secondary position where the boar's attention is not focused. Matthias had 3 such positions mapped around that clearing, each offering clean sight lines and covered exits. He reached the second position, a fallen log behind a thicket, and waited. The Germans were trained soldiers. Their panic lasted only moments before training reasserted itself. They formed a defensive perimeter, scanned the forest methodically, sent 2 scouts forward to investigate the outcrop where Matthias had been. He let them come. Patience was the essence of the hunt. His father's voice echoed in memory. The boar expects you to be where the shot came from. He charges that spot. You're already somewhere else watching him commit. The 2 German scouts reached the outcrop, found nothing, signaled the all clear. The patrol began to move again, tighter now, more cautious but moving. Matthias exhaled slowly, aligned his sights on the soldier carrying the radio pack, and squeezed. The 3rd German fell. The forest erupted in gunfire again. But this time Matthias noted something crucial. They were firing at the wrong ridge. They had triangulated his position based on where they thought the shot originated, not where it actually came from. The forest was teaching them nothing. It was merely killing them. By noon, 7 Germans were dead, and the survivors had abandoned all pretense of advancing. They had gone to ground in a shallow ravine, using fallen trees as cover, conserving ammunition, waiting for reinforcements that were already engaged in firefights 3 kilometers south. Matthias watched them from a position they had walked past twice, a natural hollow beneath the root system of an overturned oak, the same spot he'd used to observe a boar den the previous autumn. The Wehrmacht protocols were designed for open warfare, for coordinated movements across visible terrain, for enemies who revealed themselves through muzzle flash and radio chatter. They had no doctrine for this. A single invisible adversary who struck and vanished, who used terrain not as cover but as camouflage, who seemed to predict their movements before they made them. What the Germans interpreted as supernatural marksmanship was actually something simpler and more devastating: predictive positioning. Matthias wasn't reacting to their movements. He was anticipating them. He knew that soldiers under fire seek the nearest depression in terrain. He knew they would send scouts along ridge lines because military doctrine taught that high ground equals visibility. He knew they would avoid the marshy lowlands to the west because maps marked them as impassable. Every decision they made was rational, trained, correct, and exactly what Matthias expected, because he'd spent 12 years watching wild boar make the same calculations. Animals are not random. They follow patterns determined by terrain, safety, and efficiency. Humans in crisis do the same. The difference is that animals learn the terrain through survival. Soldiers learn it through maps. Around 1 p.m., the Germans made their critical mistake. An officer, recognizable by his better coat and sidearm, attempted to rally the survivors with a speech about Prussian courage and duty to the fatherland. Matthias couldn't hear the words, but he understood the psychology. The officer was trying to restore morale through appeals to ideology, to transform fear into discipline. It was a reasonable tactic. It was also fatal. The moment the soldiers stood to receive orders, exposing themselves in a ragged line, Matthias had 4 clear shots before they could react. He took 3, the officer first, then the 2 soldiers who looked most calm, and watched the formation collapse completely. The remaining 4 Germans broke and ran, abandoning equipment, fleeing east through the forest. Matthias let them go. Exhausted men spread panic better than dead men spread anything. By nightfall, those survivors would report a phantom sniper, maybe a full squad of resistance fighters, something to explain the inexplicable. The myth would work in his favor. The psychological impact rippled through Wehrmacht positions faster than official communications. By evening, 3 separate German units reported contact with Belgian partisan snipers, plural, because no single marksman could account for the casualties being reported. Company commanders demanded artillery support to suppress suspected sniper nests. But artillery required coordinates, and no one could provide coordinates for an enemy who left no trace except bodies. Forward observers reported muzzle flashes that disappeared before binoculars could focus. Radio operators intercepted no resistance communications because there were none to intercept. The Germans were fighting a doctrine that didn't exist, and the absence of pattern was more terrifying than any conventional attack. Matthias, meanwhile, experienced something unexpected: the strange calm of competence. Killing men was not like killing boar. The weight of it sat differently in his chest, heavier and colder, but the mechanics were identical: breath control, wind reading, Patience. The rifle became an extension of intention, and intention was simplified to its essence. Survival. Not his survival alone, but the survival of the forest itself as a space the Germans could not own. Each shot was a message written in a language they couldn't read. You are not safe here. You do not understand here. Here does not belong to you. As night fell, Matthias made camp in a cave system his father had shown him, a natural limestone formation invisible from above, with 3 exits and a constant 50-degree temperature. He cleaned his rifle by candlelight, counted his remaining ammunition, 37 rounds, ate dried venison from his pack, and felt the adrenaline slowly drain into exhaustion. His hands shook only when he stopped moving. Tomorrow the Germans would adjust. They would move in larger groups with better spacing, perhaps bring in specialized counter-sniper units. They would learn. But Matthias had an advantage that no amount of training could overcome. He was defending his home against invaders who saw only a battlefield. They were trying to conquer terrain. He was simply living in it. The distinction seemed small, philosophical even, but philosophy written into landscape becomes strategy, and strategy executed with indigenous knowledge becomes something that looks like magic to outsiders. The Wehrmacht would spend the next 30 hours discovering this principle through escalating casualties, while Matthias Courier slept the dreamless sleep of predators who know exactly where they are in the ecosystem. December 18th, 1944. Dawn came gray and bitter. German command had restructured their advance. Platoons now moved with designated rear guards. Scouts probed forward in staggered intervals. Officers consulted topographic maps with new urgency. They had identified the general area of yesterday's attacks and deployed a Schutzstaffel counter-sniper team. 4 men trained in Russia, veterans of Stalingrad's urban nightmare, equipped with scoped Kar 98K rifles and authorization to operate independently. They understood patience, concealment, and the psychology of sniper warfare. They were, by any conventional measure, Matthias's professional superiors. They were also hunting in his forest. The SS team established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley where yesterday's casualties occurred. Their logic was sound. The sniper would return to familiar ground, and when he revealed himself, they would triangulate and eliminate. They settled into position at 0600 hours covered by camouflage nets, disciplines themselves into absolute stillness. By 0800, they had spotted movement. A figure in civilian clothes carrying a rifle, moving along a game trail below. The team leader signaled, target acquired. They prepared to fire in coordinated sequence, a tactic that eliminated escape possibilities. What they were observing was Matthias's coat, stuffed with pine branches and dragged along the trail by a cord tied to a deer he'd wounded the previous night. The deer moved naturally, following its instinct to seek water despite injury, and the coat moved with it. A crude decoy that worked because the SS team was looking for what they expected to see, a sniper repeating his pattern. While they focused on the valley, Matthias watched them from a position 200 meters behind and above their observation post. He'd found their location at dawn by following the logic of his own terrain knowledge. If I were hunting me, where would I set up? The answer was obvious. The same ridge he'd used to ambush boar that descended to the valley stream. The SS team had chosen well. They simply hadn't chosen first. Matthias studied them through his iron sights. They were good. Minimal movement, proper spacing, excellent discipline. Killing them felt different than killing the patrol yesterday. These men were craftsmen, not just soldiers. They understood the hunt. But understanding the hunt in Russian ruins was not the same as understanding this specific forest, these specific hills, this specific intersection of terrain and weather and animal behavior. They were fluent in a language. He was born into it. The ethical weight finally arrived in full force, not during the killing but in the moments before. Matthias's finger rested on the trigger, and for the first time since this began, he hesitated. These were not invaders stumbling through his forest in ignorance. These were hunters like him, men who read wind and calculated distance and understood patience. In another context, they might have been colleagues sharing techniques over schnapps. The war had made them enemies, but the craft made them brothers. His father's voice again from a conversation years past. You'll know you're a real hunter when you feel sorry for the boar, when you understand he's just trying to live, doing exactly what he should be doing, and you're about to end him anyway. That sorrow doesn't mean you don't shoot. It means you shoot clean. You owe him that respect. Matthias exhaled slowly and fired. The SS team leader dropped instantly, a clean headshot. No suffering. The other three reacted with impressive speed, rolling to new positions, scanning for muzzle flash. But Matthias had already moved, gliding down a slope he'd descended 1,000 times, using a route that was invisible from the ridge because it followed a fold in the terrain that didn't appear on military maps. He repositioned 40 meters south, used a standing tree as brace, and fired again. Another SS sniper fell. The remaining two abandoned their equipment and retreated, not in panic but in tactical withdrawal, recognizing they were outmatched not in skill, but in environmental knowledge. Matthias let them go. The message was delivered. By midday, Wehrmacht command faced an impossible situation. Forward progress had stalled. Casualties were mounting, not in the dramatic numbers of a major battle, but in the demoralizing arithmetic of steady attrition without visible enemy. Patrols reported feeling watched constantly. Soldiers began refusing to take point positions. A captain wrote in his log, "The forest has become hostile in a way that transcends military opposition. It is as if the terrain itself rejects our presence." This was, in fact, precisely what was happening. Matthias Courier was not fighting a conventional resistance action. He was functioning as the forest's immune system, an antibody responding to foreign intrusion. The Germans could bring more men, better weapons, superior tactics, but they could not bring the one thing that mattered. They could not belong here. And in war, as in hunting, belonging to the terrain is 90% of victory. The escalation arrived at 1400 hours. A full Wehrmacht company, 150 men, supported by 2 armored reconnaissance vehicles and a mortar team. German command had concluded that the sniper threat required overwhelming force and systematic clearing operations. They would sweep the forest in coordinated lines, using artillery to suppress suspected positions, leaving no space unexamined. It was a rational response. It was also exactly the kind of large-scale movement that Matthias had been waiting for. The principle his father had taught him about hunting large boar sounders, groups of a dozen or more, was counterintuitive. The more of them there are, the safer you are. A single boar is cautious, unpredictable. A group follows patterns. They watch each other instead of watching for you. They make noise coordinating. And when one panics, they all panic, even the smart ones. The Wehrmacht company advanced through the forest in 3 parallel columns, maintaining visual contact between units, officers shouting orders to keep formation tight. It was textbook infantry doctrine for hostile terrain. It was also an acoustic nightmare. Matthias heard them coming from 800 meters away, boots breaking frozen ground, equipment rattling, commands echoing through bare trees. He positioned himself on a slope overlooking their projected path, found a natural shooting lane where the forest opened along a frozen streambed, and waited. The German formation was designed to be mutually supporting. Each column could provide covering fire for the others, but mutual support requires knowing where the threat is coming from. When Matthias fired into the center column, soldiers in all 3 columns returned fire, but they fired into each other's positions, creating a 3-way crossfire that Matthias didn't need to participate in. He fired 6 shots in 90 seconds, enough to wound 4 soldiers and kill 2, then withdrew completely, moving perpendicular to the German advance, relocating to a position they had already passed. The Wehrmacht company spent the next 3 hours in confused firefight with themselves, burning through ammunition, calling for artillery support on their own positions, creating casualties through friendly fire that exceeded anything Matthias could have achieved alone. By 1700 hours, the company commander called a halt to regroup and treat wounded. Official casualties: 11 dead, 19 wounded. Actual casualties inflicted by Matthias: 6. The rest were victims of fear, confusion, and the acoustic chaos of forest warfare. The difference didn't matter. The result was the same. A company strength unit had been combat ineffective for 4 hours, and they still had no idea where their enemy actually was. As night fell on December 18th, something unexpected happened. American forces, having regrouped from the initial German assault, began pushing back through the southern Ardennes. Artillery fire bloomed on the horizon, orange flowers against the black sky. The Wehrmacht units in Matthias's sector received urgent orders to disengage and reinforce positions 12 kilometers east. The German withdrawal was hasty, organized, but pressured, exactly the moment when military discipline frays and soldiers become vulnerable. Matthias watched columns of Wehrmacht infantry trudge past his position, exhausted men carrying wounded comrades, no longer advancing with confidence but retreating with relief. He could have killed 20 of them easily. Instead, he held fire. This was not mercy exactly, but calculation of a different sort. The men he'd fought today would return to their units with stories. They would tell other Germans that the Ardennes forest was haunted by an invisible marksman who knew the terrain like a ghost knows its graveyard. They would spread fear more efficiently than bullets could. And fear, in military operations, is a force multiplier that works in reverse. It makes large armies behave like small ones, makes brave men hesitate, makes commanders second guess. But as the German columns passed, Matthias noticed something that chilled him more than the winter air. Several soldiers were not Wehrmacht but SS, hardened men from Eastern Front units, bearing the insignia of divisions that had earned reputations for both competence and atrocity. These were not garrison troops or conscripted infantry. These were true believers, men for whom retreat was temporary, and vengeance was doctrine. One of them, an Obersturmführer with a scarred face and eyes that scanned the forest with professional suspicion, stopped his squad and pointed directly at the ridge where Matthias lay concealed. Not at Matthias specifically, but at the terrain itself, the obvious advantages it offered. The officer said something to his men, then marked something on a map. Matthias understood instantly. They were plotting counter-sniper positions for when they returned. The Germans were learning. Tomorrow, if they came back, they would not come as confused invaders, but as informed adversaries. They would bring spotters, coordinate fire teams, use smoke and suppression. They would transform this forest from Matthias's advantage into contested ground. The boy with the hunting rifle had won 2 days through superior knowledge, but knowledge could be acquired, and resources could be concentrated, and the Wehrmacht, for all its failings, was very, very good at adapting. December 19th, 1944, 5:30 hours. Matthias woke to the sound he'd been dreading, diesel engines. Not the light reconnaissance vehicles from yesterday, but heavy armor, Panther tanks, judging by the deep growl of their engines. The Germans had called in mechanized support specifically to deal with one teenager with a rifle, which should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like checkmate being announced 3 moves in advance. Tanks made the forest's concealment irrelevant. They could simply blast suspected positions until nothing remained. But Matthias's father had hunted during the Great War, and he'd told stories about how Belgian resistance fighters dealt with German armor in 1918. You don't fight the tank, you fight the men around the tank. Armor makes soldiers lazy. They think they're invincible, so they get sloppy. They bunch up behind the steel, use it as mobile cover. That's when they're most vulnerable. 3 Panther tanks rolled into the forest along the main logging road, accompanied by 2 full platoons of infantry. Matthias watched from high ground, noting their formation. The tanks moved in single file. The road couldn't accommodate wider deployment, with infantry clustered behind each vehicle exactly as his father had predicted. They were using armor doctrine in terrain where armor couldn't maneuver. The first principle of forest warfare is that roads are death traps. They offer speed but eliminate options. The Germans understood this theoretically, but theory and practice diverge when you're cold, tired, and scared. The comfort of a road, the illusion of progress and safety it provides, overrides tactical awareness. Matthias shadowed the column for an hour, never firing, simply observing. He noted which soldiers looked alert versus which looked exhausted, which officers consulted maps versus which simply followed, where the formation tightened and where it loosened. He was reading the unit's psychology, like tracking a wounded animal, looking for the moment when fatigue and false security created opportunity. That moment came when the lead tank stopped to negotiate a fallen tree. The column compressed, infantry gathering in clusters, officers stepping out to assess the obstacle. Matthias had dropped that tree across the road 2 hours before dawn, using techniques his father had taught him for creating boar ambush points. The Wehrmacht was now stacked in a killing zone of their own choosing, and they had no idea they'd made a choice. Matthias fired from 220 meters, targeting the officer examining the fallen tree. The shot was perfect. The officer collapsed, and for 3 seconds the column froze in that terrible space between peace and chaos, where the mind rejects what the body already knows. Then hell arrived properly. The infantry scattered into the forest on both sides of the road, exactly as Matthias expected, fleeing the exposure of open ground for the imagined safety of trees. The tanks buttoned up, turrets rotating, machine guns firing blindly into the forest canopy. It was overwhelming firepower deployed with zero effectiveness because they had no target, only fear. Matthias was already moving to his third position of the morning, a limestone outcrop overlooking the road from the opposite side, offering angles on the soldiers who'd fled into the western tree line. They were taking cover behind thick oaks, smart positioning under normal circumstances, but they'd positioned themselves with their backs to the very direction Matthias had relocated to. He fired 4 times in 20 seconds, dropping 3 soldiers and forcing the others to abandon their cover and sprint deeper into the forest. This created exactly what Matthias needed: chaos and separation. The German formation, which had started as a coordinated mechanized unit, was now fragmented into isolated groups with no visual contact, no communication, and no unified command. The tanks, designed to be the column's strength, had become its liability. They couldn't maneuver off-road without risking the forest floor's stability, couldn't see through the dense trees, and couldn't engage an enemy they couldn't locate. Their machine guns tore through the canopy, shredding bark and branches, but Matthias was below the firing line, sheltered by terrain folds invisible from the road. Around 1,000 hours, the Germans made their final tactical error. They called in artillery support. The shells impacted 300 meters north of Matthias's actual position, obliterating empty forest and creating a thunderous barrage that achieved nothing except destroying visibility with smoke and confirming to every Wehrmacht unit in the sector that something in the Ardennes was going very, very wrong. When the artillery lifted, the German column attempted an organized withdrawal, tanks reversing down the road, infantry providing covering fire into empty forest. Matthias let them go, conserving his remaining ammunition. By noon, the Wehrmacht had committed over 400 men and significant armor to suppress a single sniper, suffered 37 confirmed casualties, and achieved precisely nothing except proving that the Ardennes forest could not be taken by force alone. By afternoon of December 19th, Allied intelligence began receiving reports of unexpected German withdrawals from certain Ardennes sectors. Wehrmacht units that should have been advancing were instead consolidating, commanders requesting reinforcements not for attack, but for securing rear areas against partisan activity. An American colonel reviewing the reports noted with confusion, "They're acting like they're being hit by a major resistance network, but OSS confirms no organized Belgian activity in those grid squares." What the colonel couldn't know was that Matthias Courier, exhausted and down to his last 11 rounds, was currently hiding in a hollow tree, listening to his own heartbeat and wondering if he would survive another day. The mythology the Germans had built around him, the phantom sniper network, the coordinated resistance fighters, the expert marksman, was in stark contrast to the reality. A 17-year-old boy who smelled like wet wool and fear, whose hands shook so badly he could barely load his rifle, who had killed more men in 2 days than most soldiers killed in entire wars. He was not brave. He was not special. He was simply in his forest, using knowledge his father had given him, executing techniques designed for hunting animals against an enemy that happened to move like animals when they were scared. The transformation he'd undergone was not from boy to soldier, but from hunter to weapon, a distinction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As dusk fell, Matthias heard something unexpected. Belgian voices, speaking French with local accents, calling his name. He emerged cautiously to find 3 men from the village, resistance fighters who'd been hiding in the hills, staring at him with expressions mixing awe and disbelief. "The Germans are saying there's a whole squad of snipers in these woods," one said. "How many of you are there?" Matthias looked at his rifle, then at the men, then back at the forest that had protected him. "Just me," he said, "and the forest." The resistance fighters didn't believe him at first, couldn't reconcile the math of German casualties with the reality of this exhausted teenager. But the rifle's barrel told its own truth, worn from repeated firing, still warm despite the cold. One fighter, a former Belgian army corporal, examined Matthias with professional assessment and said quietly, "You need to come with us. The Germans won't stop. They can't afford to. You've made them look weak." December 20th, 1944. The Americans broke through German lines 16 kilometers south, and the Wehrmacht began full retreat from the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble, was collapsing. But in the sector where Matthias had operated, German command made one last decision. A mechanized SS unit, recently arrived from the Eastern Front, would conduct a punitive sweep through the forest, not to achieve military objectives but to restore honor, to prove that the Wehrmacht could not be defeated by a single sniper, to demonstrate dominance even in retreat. They came with overwhelming force. 2 companies, armor support, combat engineers, orders to burn any structure that could provide shelter. It was vengeance disguised as tactics. Matthias, now with the resistance fighters, watched the German column from a distance. The resistance leader wanted to engage, to bloody the SS before they escaped. Matthias said no. They're not here to fight, he explained. They're here to prove something to themselves. Let them prove it to empty forest. It was the hardest decision he'd made. Harder than any shot, harder than any kill, because letting them go felt like surrender, and surrender felt like betraying the men he'd killed, as if their deaths only mattered if he kept fighting. But his father had taught him one final lesson about hunting, the lesson that separated sport from survival. You don't hunt to prove you're strong. You hunt to eat, to live, to protect what's yours. The moment hunting becomes about your pride, you've already lost, because pride makes you take stupid risks, and stupid risks get you killed. The SS column burned 3 empty cabins, fired thousands of rounds into vacant forest, and declared the sector cleared of partisan activity. They retreated believing they'd won. Matthias watched them go, understanding that victory and belief are not the same thing, and sometimes the greatest triumph is letting your enemy convince themselves they were never really defeated, just strategically redirected. The forest remained. The Germans left. And somewhere in the mathematics of war, those 2 facts constituted a win, even if it felt like nothing at all. That night, as American forces occupied the village and Belgian flags emerged from hiding, someone asked Matthias how many Germans he'd killed. I don't know, he said, which was true. He'd been counting shots, not bodies. The number 107 came later, from Wehrmacht casualty reports cross-referenced with location and date. But Matthias never confirmed it, never claimed it, never spoke about it except to say, I just hunted. The forest did the rest. The official record shows that between December 17 and 20, 1944, Wehrmacht forces in a specific sector of the Ardennes forest suffered 107 confirmed casualties attributed to small arms fire from an unidentified source. German after-action reports reference coordinated sniper teams and Belgian resistance network. No such network existed in that location. There was only Matthias' Courier, his father's hunting rifle, and knowledge of terrain so complete it became tactical advantage indistinguishable from magic. After the war, Matthias returned to his family's farm, never spoke publicly about those 4 days, refused medals from both the Belgian government and American military. He married, raised children, taught them to hunt, but never taught them the techniques his father had given him. When asked why, he said simply, those skills belong to a different kind of forest than the one we live in now. He died in 1993, age 66, from heart failure. At his funeral, a former Wehrmacht soldier, one of the survivors from the December 18th company action, appeared uninvited, stood at the back of the church and wept. No one knew why he'd come, and he left before anyone could ask. But those who understood history recognized the moment for what it was. A soldier paying respect to an enemy who'd taught him that courage and technology and training are nothing compared to belonging to the ground you're fighting on. The wild boar hunting trick that made Matthias' Courier lethal was not a trick at all. It was ecological knowledge weaponized by necessity, the understanding that predators don't conquer territory. They inhabit it so completely that the distinction between hunter and habitat disappears. His father had taught him to think like the forest thinks, to move like the forest moves, to be patient like the forest is patient. Against that level of integration, armies are just loud visitors who eventually go home. The lesson isn't about violence or victory. It's about the irreplaceable advantage of intimate knowledge, the power of being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you've been prepared your entire life to do. Matthias' Courier took out 107 Germans, not because he was special, but because when war came to his forest he was already there, rooted, waiting, invisible, and absolutely lethal. The Germans were never fighting a boy with a rifle. They were fighting the forest itself, and forests always win if you give them enough time.